ladies and gentlemen, and let's get started with the second and the final session of the Strategy and Policy Day. I'm honored to present our next moderator, Dr. James Shires, who is an assistant professor at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at the University of Leiden and holds a DPhil in International Relations from the University of Oxford. Please, James, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and I'm very excited to be introducing our next panel. Hi to everyone online dialing in. Very glad you could be with us. This promises to be a really fantastic hour's entertainment, but also in-depth, cutting-edge academic discussion. Our panelists are the best people you could possibly hope to have on this sort of call, starting with Jay Healy. Jay Healy's a senior research scholar at Columbia University. He's got masses of private sector and public sector experience, and he's also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's edited a really great book on cyber conflict, one of the classics in the domain called A Fierce Domain, and he's almost like a no-nose, right? So he's right at the center of research on cyber conflict. Without any further ado, go straight to with our first presentation. We'll then go on to the next speakers who will talk for 10 to 15 minutes. And as before, I'll bring up written questions that can be submitted throughout after they've finished. Jay, the floor is yours.
Absolutely fabulous. Thank you, James, for that great introduction. Good morning to those of you in my continent. Good afternoon to those of you in our host continent. Good evening to those joining in from Asia. Really thrilled to be here. I first went to CyCon in 2009 and got to hear Martin Libicki at that event, and have been going pretty much steadily ever since 2009. And so disappointed we won't be seeing all each other in Tallinn, but so glad that we can be seeing each other over the internet. The talk that I have done, the paper that I did, I am representing my two co-authors, J.D. Work and Neil Jenkins today. And we wanted to look at a significant problem in cybersecurity practice that we felt has been under-examined through scholarship. We say again and again, or you see again and again in theories and strategies, that defenders must impose costs on the attackers, that we need to have more disruptions against the adversaries so that we can cause friction. This is central to the new US strategy of persistent engagement. You see it frequently through botnet takedowns. You see it even through naming and shaming. For example, the Dutch went and released photos of GRU hacking teams when they were in the Netherlands. But there hadn't been a significant way of looking at the impact of those operations. And so our paper was called Defenders Disrupting Adversaries. And what we did in this, we are trying to go for three things in this paper, and not necessarily achieving them all, but at least starting to approach this in a more structured and disciplined way. So first, we have a framework where we said, how can we better talk about, in a repeatable and transparent manner, what we mean when we say disruptive counter cyber operations? And I'll keep using that phrase, disruptive counter cyber operations. Second, we include 4 case studies using that framework of some of the better known incidents of disruptive counter cyber operations. And last, and I think perhaps most importantly, we have the first data set of, I believe it's 103 different times when the defenders disrupted adversaries in different ways. We haven't fully coded that data set to the framework, but we wanted to get it out there so that other researchers can work on it. And again, we think this is especially timely now that the United States is saying that such operations are going to form the center of the strategy to cause friction. So first, let's look at what we mean by that phrase, disruptive counter cyber operations. Again, the thing that we think is most important in this paper is starting to give ourselves this transparent and repeatable framework so that we're using words in a similar manner, and so that when we disagree, we can at least be disagreeing on the meat of the issue and not the framing. So we said a disruptive counter cyber operation are positive steps for defeating a specific cyber adversary, usually taken by defenders in response to a specific attack or campaign, often directly disrupt an adversary's technology. The main action is typically either outside of the defender's own network or based on specific intelligence about how that adversary operates. Now, that's less a definition than a description. And in the paper, we go through each element of that description to try and pull it apart. In general, we're trying to say it has to be a positive action by the defender. It can't be just passive. It should be directed at a specific adversary or specific adversary operation. For example, if you find out, like, just pushing a new indicator to your firewalls that you've been told is helpful, well, we consider that more passive defense. You're doing that for general protection. Versus if you say, we have an election coming up, we know the GRU tends to use these kinds of attacks, and therefore these indicators are specifically useful because we have to defeat this adversary. We're treating as more likely to be in scope. So after that, we get into our specific framework. Now, what we're trying to measure, the dependent variable, is the effect and duration of the disruption. And you'll see when you check out the paper on the CyCon website that we keep these very, very simple. I was going to say generic, but I'll say very simple. Measurement, as many of us know, is very, very difficult when you're trying to look at all things cyber. So we try and keep it as simplified as we can. For example, effect, we're just saying minor, significant, decisive. Duration, days to weeks, weeks to months, months to years, and the like. And the independent variables, we look at across different areas. And let me just say, as I'm introducing the dependent variables, saying, right, look, we're looking at effect and duration. One of the things that was really stuck, particularly in my head as we looked at this research, was many of you will have seen, last year, 2019, there's an adversary group called Oil Rig. APT also went by APT-34 or Helix Kitten. That was just absolutely dismantled online. Almost everything about this Iranian group got revealed online. Their operations, their persona, their malware. And this really drove me to say, boy, if they are able to bounce back relatively quickly, having been so substantially disassembled online, then that tells us something very, very important about persistent engagement and about disruptive counter cyber operations. If a group is hit that badly and is able to bounce back, it gives us incredibly important lessons. Likewise, or contrary-wise, if APT-34 Oil Rig Helix Kitten essentially said, you know what, we just better pack it in. This one-off event was so bad that let's just disband the group and farm the resources out to other places. Again, that teaches us something very, very important. Ned Moran of Microsoft had come out a couple weeks ago, and said it looks like it was actually relatively brief that they were down. So we think this is a very, very important question, and we hope our framework is very useful for trying to help ask this in a more structured way. Okay. So if the dependent variables are the effects and the duration, how badly and how long an adversary is disrupted, on the independent variables, we say, well, what is the type of disruption, right? You can categorize it by the functional object which is targeted or by the action. Like, are you sinkholing traffic? Are you seizing control of the adversary's C2 network? We look at the frequency of the disruptive activity. What happened to oil rig APT34 helix kitten was essentially a one-off, right? They get hit really, really badly, but they get hit once. That's very different from what Cyber Command is looking for, right? Cyber Command is looking for a more sustained operation. One of our case studies looks at the Configure working group, which was going after the Configure malware a decade ago. That was sustained constantly over the course of 18 months, this constant back and forth. The framework also looks at the potential reasons for delay in returning to operations. For example, in many cases, it's just technical, right? Your infrastructure, your C2 gets burned and it just takes you a while to rebuild it. I was talking to one of the very experienced and well-known cyber threat intelligence analysts who looked at, there was a big takedown of announcement of adversaries that were in home routers. And he said, boy, you know, if the adversaries had wanted to, they could have reestablished themselves immediately, but they decided not to, right? There's no technical reasons. It was behavioral or bureaucratic. We also look at, you know, there's political or geopolitical, right? Political, maybe if we just say, you know what, that group's not worth it anymore, they're out of favor now. Geopolitical, if the adversary fears the backlash for operating in that way again. We think it's very important to look at the geopolitical context of the disruption. As we went through the data set, it was quite clear that you had different responses, whether we were in a situation of peace, tension, crisis, or outright war. Last, we looked at the type of adversary, both the disrupted actor and the disrupting actor, so that because we think that will be important in a lot of these. So for the different cases, I won't get into too many of them. We looked at Code Red. Many of you might not know Code Red. It was back in 2001. In July 2001, it was actually the incident that really helped make my name when I was much younger and working at a bank's computer emergency response team. And so we say that was and we look at Code Red in particular because there was a white worm that was associated with it. That is, someone had coded a piece of malware that went and tried to inoculate systems against Code Red. So you not only had Code Red spreading, but you had someone that was writing their own software that would patch the hole. We looked at the Configure disruption as another case study, which I've already mentioned. Great case study and very well documented, including by the book Worm, which is a full book-length expose of exactly how the defenders responded over time. We looked at the Game Over Zeus takedown. Clearly, botnet takedowns are one of the most compelling aspects of disruptive counter-cyber operations, and one of the ones that we have some of the best examples of. And last, we look at we call it China-related disclosures, but this is everything from the APT1 paper, which came out some years ago, and so that we can examine across these case studies and using the framework. Those case studies are nice examples. But what we really hope is that we're able, that us and other researchers are able to use the data set here. And right now the data set is just in the PDF version. I'll work with, especially JD Work, my co-author that did the most on this aspect of it, to get the data set up somewhere, either at Columbia or Marine Corps University, in a more useful format for scholars. It's got 103 rows of different disruptive counter-cyber operations going back to 1987. Most of the cases are within the last, call them 5-6 years. But as far as we know, this is the first real published data set on this. It is certainly incomplete. Certainly we need to do more work, either ourselves or with other researchers and scholars, to build out these data sets, to not just have them as a row with some sources, but to build them out into a more complete data set. And we look forward to working with many of you for that. I will point out that some of my students at Columbia University School of International Public Affairs did a related set of work for their capstone project, overseen by Neil Pollard, that we're looking specifically at the naming and shaming aspect of what happens when an adversary has been named or shamed. And we hope over the coming months be putting these different aspects of the research together in one place. So of course, we've got some findings listed and areas for further research, but you can look at the paper on that. And let me turn it back to Matt. Let me turn it back to James. Thanks very much, and I can't wait to hear from the rest of the panelists and the questions.
Jay, thanks so much, but don't worry, to be honest, the moderators are pretty interchangeable, so that's not too much of a problem. It's a really fantastic bit of research. What I like is that Jay does two things really well, which are really hard to do in the same paper, and his co-authors as well. The first is to take us back in time, right? He gives us a good history and says, look, this was not something that's just happened over the last year or few years. Disruptive counter-cyber operations have been happening for a long time. And he encourages researchers, it's a real invitation to go back, look at these historic cases, see what we can learn from them. On the other hand, he also says this is a strategic change. As we know, the strategy of engagement and defend forward has prioritized these far above their previous place in the hierarchy of strategic options in the US. So he makes both those points, which are not easy to do together. Our next speaker takes the strategic question of persistent engagement even further. He asks, what can AI add to this? What are the elements of persistent engagement and new strategic questions raised by artificial intelligence? He's a perfect person to do this because he's got a really broad range of research topics in this area. I first encountered his work with an article on monism and dualism in cybersecurity research, very aptly and in my opinion, far too late, bringing Leibniz back into computer science and cybersecurity research. So without any further pontificating on my part, I'm going to turn you over to he's an assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. He teaches across the whole security policy, political science, and conflict analysis. And he's got a wide range of published work, books, and many articles. And I really encourage you to check them out, as well as the current paper, which we'll talk about now. Chris, it's all yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Cool. Well, thank you very much. And thanks as well, just right off the bat, to both sets of my co-panelists for writing such interesting papers. Both of them do different but very, very critical things. One of which, of course, is the production of a data set. Jay and your colleagues, that is something that is in short supply in the academic side of the cyber conflict studies field. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Keir. His and Kim's paper is fascinating. I think we've all kind of been asked that compelling question, you know, what if 2016, the political interference in the US elections, which is the paradigm case that people hold up, what if that was AI enabled, right? It's kind of the what if 9/11, you know, the terrorists were cyber savvy. You got a similar kind of compelling question. So I'm really excited to be on this panel. So in the paper I published in the proceedings of this year's CyCon, which you can go on the website and find, it's called Problems of Poison. I'm specifically looking at the intersection of cyber operations and developments in artificial intelligence methods. So this is part of a pretty broad project for me, but I think the scope of this paper is of paramount significance as we begin to think more clearly about the impact of AI systems on cyber. And that's because this paper I wrote attempts with, you know, policymakers and strategic planners in mind specifically to try to offer some categorical breakdowns of what AI will do for offensive cyber, and then to look at strategic implications thereof for national strategy, and particularly with the new persistent engagement approach that's been adopted here in the US in mind. So I was particularly thrilled to see that several papers of this year's proceedings look at AI from a variety of perspectives. As most people, as many of the people listening to this almost certainly know, AI is, you know, not exclusively something of the future or even the near future. AI as this, basket of technologies that link advances in machine learning and reasoning, robotics, automated perception, etc. AI has been used in applications across many sectors of industry and society over the past couple of decades, particularly over the past few years. And at this point, the scientific and industrial field of AI and machine learning research is immense. That said, at least within the academic and practitioner communities interested in how AI might transform national security, the research program is certainly not non-existent, but it's just now picking up a little bit of speed. And thus far, when I was preparing to submit something for CyCon this year, and I was looking at this project, which was partly underway at the time, I noticed that, remarkably little had been done to apply theory and attempt to assess how AI might actually transform the character of the strategic environment in which states have to act to secure their national interests. So I think I'm the first of the AI papers at CyCon this year. So let me just do a very brief, what is AI? And in the interest of time, I'm going to leave the more fleshed out technical discussions to the panelists are going to come over the next couple of days. But broadly, I think about AI as a field defined by the goal of moving beyond the mere programmability of contemporary computer systems to build complex thinking constructs that are capable of concept formation, abstract reasoning, environment recognition, and specifically self-improvement. And since the days of Norbert Wiener and Marvin Minsky and von Neumann, others, we've seen a vast range of these kinds of constructs applied in pretty narrow terms, admittedly, but across pretty much all areas of modern society in some fashion. In terms of how AI is applied, I argue in the paper that the technologies of AI might most simply be thought of as existing across three main categories. So movement, sensing and perception, and then machine reasoning and learning. The last of which, of course, machine learning being by far the most revolutionary area within these categories. So machine learning, just very briefly, so whereas, conventional computing generically involves, putting data into, let's just generically say an algorithm that then outputs some functional result, machine learning involves more inputting both data and, let's say, a desired result to a learner algorithm, a neural network of one kind or another that infers and then it outputs yet another algorithm tailored to allow for intelligent engagement with the subject data. And so what we're talking about with AI here is an incredibly powerful technology, specifically because it doesn't try to solve computational challenges by piling on the processing power or what have you. It's trying to overcome challenges by simplifying or sidestepping these challenges by a process of ongoing reprogramming. So cyber ops. When it comes to cyber operations, the conventional wisdom out there is that AI, straightforwardly is going to stand to make both defensive and offensive tools more powerful. Plain and simple. That's it. There's already a pretty large technical body of work on what this kind of upgrading of cyber by AI might look like. There's a I think it's called DeepLocker. IBM actually created an example piece of malware that was pretty fascinating. It posed as an internet video, voice over internet protocol application, and then waited until it could visually and audibly recognize its next target before jumping to them. So there's some pretty interesting examples out there of what this might look like. With offensive cyber, I think it would be fair to say, with just a couple of exceptions, that we probably want to be thinking about this upgrading of cyber by AI along four lines, three of which are pretty interconnected. So the first one, AI pretends this, I think, a dramatically improved ability for attackers to probe and to understand the attack surface of a target at some scale. And that comes in two flavors, basically. On the one hand, at the functional level, smarter malware has already been demonstrated to be able to infer from incoming data and assign probability values to the next possible set of target machines. We should also be thinking from an operations planning perspective, though. For instance, maybe thinking about the wealth of stolen data that populates criminal spaces. given the manner in which you get criminal models of operation, often closely mirroring, global digital platform capitalism models, an upgrading of analytic capabilities on the part of criminals essentially stands to increase the value of stolen assets for a variety of malicious purposes. And it also probably increases the incentive towards further mass data theft. Back to the operational level, though, the second area of AI upgrading, I argue in the paper, of cyber offensive methods is just the inevitable ability of malware to autonomously select from a toolkit of operations for further spread. It's fairly straightforward. It's already a reality to some degree. But relatedly, we should also be worried about AI-programmed malware that will inevitably be able to select its own strategies, in addition to just simple toolkit selection. Perhaps avoiding some patterns of approach to intrusion when given defensive behavior is detected, going low and slow in order to avoid compromise, that kind of thing. And I think the real added value of AI, I will say here, is a perspective leveling of the playing field, where we're talking about less well-resourced actors finding themselves more relatively capable vis-a-vis sophisticated state and criminal actors that can already do all of the above in a relatively sophisticated fashion. And then finally, of course, defenders face the challenge of malware that's going to be able to compartmentalize itself into different mindsets, essentially, compartmentalizing the lessons a program learns and then applying them differently across different circumstances. But developments in the offense are going to be matched in many cases by the increasing sophistication of defensive efforts. I just don't think it's, I think it's a bit disingenuous basically to characterize the implications of AI upgrading for cyber ops as just a tit for tat kind of gradual escalation of improvements for defenders and attackers. Because with AI, we also seriously have to worry about subversion, about cyber AI attacks that target the legitimate functionality of learner techniques that get baked into all manner of system. And in broad strokes, these kind of attacks are going to come in two forms. Input attacks, the kind of things that try to mislead AI systems and cause them to intentionally misclassify activity. And then secondly, and this is where the title of the paper comes from, efforts that look to kind of compromise how the AI system itself works, right? To poison the intelligence system so that its model of the environment just doesn't accurately represent reality. So there's a few other things I can say there. In the interest of time, let me kind of just jump to the final stages of the paper I wrote here, talk specifically about persistent engagement. There are obviously distinct implications of cyber AI attacks and the AI upgrading of cyber ops as we conventionally think of them for the strategy of cyber conflicts in general. Smarter tools exist that can more reliably avoid detection, take lateral routes to target, scale effects more suddenly and quickly than is the norm today. Adversaries are obviously, potentially at least, likely to exhibit increased willingness to continue operation under circumstances they might not have previously. And of course, AI adds new dimensions to the traditional AI attribution perception problems we have in cyberspace. But with persistent engagement specifically, I think there's some more to be said that's of particular relevance given that we're kind of finding our way with the strategy right now. So with persistent engagement, the idea is simply that forward operation is going to allow the United States, other countries if they adopt the strategy, to both see attacks before they occur and then to produce friction that increases costs of antagonism for adversaries. So one immediate concern, I think, with AI is that it portends kind of a narrowing of the space within which adversaries are probably going to take cost-benefit calculations and then come to the belief that benefits of further action are outweighed by the costs that might be imposed in the domain by forward defenders. So especially given that stakes of defection from agreed conditions of competition, they're not typically very high in political terms with cyber conflict, at least we think. I know I'm actually going to reference a great article that one of my panelists, Healy, wrote in the Journal of Cybersecurity recently on that front. But particularly given the political costs of defection from these conditions the strategy outlines are probably not particularly high, then this contraction of the space wherein persuasion is argued to be possible ostensibly makes meaningful signaling even more difficult, case by case. And I think this is particularly the case as well, given that there's a fundamental limitation contained in the strategy of persistent engagement, in that contestation is essentially the only method of communication involved, right? AI exacerbates the challenges that this poses. I think in particular, a major challenge is that, failed friction will lead to these aggression spirals in which both sides continue to escalate in search of costly digital territory. Well, AI adds dimensionality to that concern. Simplistically, AI is likely to lower the costs of reconstruction of digital assets across the board. And with AI, aggression spirals might actually be somewhat attractive to adversaries, at least under controlled conditions, or what they believe are control conditions, as they're looking for opportunities to train defensive platforms and defenders themselves to showcase strategies of aggression that might be intended to mislead peer competitors, and so on. AI also adds a little bit further dimensionality to the question of what acceptable adversary behavior looks like in the domain. One problem is obviously the centrality of cyberspace for all manner of AI attacks, right? If you want to subvert an AI model linked to something beyond the conventional scope of cyber conflict, you're likely still attacking in the fifth domain. I'm sure you might, attack via, physical media insertion, but you're likely going to attack via cyberspace. And so particularly if subversive attacks that have increasingly real meaning for strategic knowledge capabilities are imperative for competitors heavily invested in the use of AI, then we're left with this question of what conventional metrics, as we currently have them, can possibly be used to gauge aggression. And I'll leave this point aside, but I think that's particularly salient given that the PE strategy holds espionage apart as acceptable behavior. Let me just end with this. I think a final implication for AI for current approaches to cyber conflict is the manner in which efforts to secure cyberspace might degrade the reality of an open and reliable and secure, interoperable internet. Cyber strategy in the West and in Western states, whether it's PE or something else, tend to naturally rely on a great deal of trust amongst allies, civil society, private sector partners. And with AI, the promise and problem of poisoning the battle space suggests a potentially massive wrinkle for broader Western efforts to head a liberal world order. Let me leave that there. Again, let me just simply say that I don't think that AI itself inevitably means advantages for attackers over defenders or vice versa, but I do think that adversarial learning techniques certainly add complexity to an already complex set of operational conditions in cyberspace. And there are reasons we might think that there will be an uptick in offensive behavior along several lines, as we go forward. And with that, let me pass it back over to you, James, and cut myself off there.
Chris, thanks so much. It's such a rich paper, and you did a great job of doing justice to it in that very short time. But I really encourage everyone who's watching to check it out, get into the detail. One of the things it does really well is really have a nuanced idea of how AI will affect cyber operations in different ways for different threat groups and for different offenders, right? Defenders. Some will benefit more than others. Some are already doing this kind of thing, and it changes the cost-benefit resource investment around the whole environment. To go to our last paper, maybe if the connection between Chris's paper was persistent engagement and questions of strategy, the connection between Chris's paper and Keir's paper is in this idea of AI and the difficult questions it raises about the adoption of new systems and the potential for the subversion of those systems. And how both defenders and offenders and offensive actors can both use new techniques for intrusion and influence, but they can also be undermined by adopting those new techniques. Keir is a stalwart in the field. He's been researching this for many years and has produced many of the finest works on cyber conflict that I've known and relied on throughout. He's a fellow at Chatham House, director at the Conflict Studies Center. He has a great focus on especially Russian actions in this domain as well, but I'll leave Keir to explain more about his paper and introduce you to his work in more detail. So Keir, over to you.
James, thanks very much for that intro. It's great to join this all-star cast. And actually, this panel has been set up really well because it allows me to take some of the principles that Christopher introduced and then apply them to one of those specific domains, James, that you just mentioned of online confrontation. And in this case, it is malign influence, subversion, and destabilization through disinformation. Now, the paper in the proceedings was written jointly by me and Kim Hartman. Kim is a computer scientist, and I'm a professional pessimist about malign influence. So when we work together, we tend to end up with fairly dystopian results. In this particular case, we wanted to look at whether machine learning and AI would transform the techniques and capabilities and reach and impact, especially of disinformation and information warfare overall. And we think that, yes, the effect could be transformative. Because up until this point, online malign influence and disinformation campaigns have primarily been operated and directed manually, or with the assistance of relatively crude and simple bots, because the design, the production, and dissemination of malicious material has been processed by humans. But the trend of utilizing AI methods to compose manipulated or fake material that we observed during 2019 shows that it's possible to automate the processes that are needed to successfully operate disinformation campaigns. Because if we think back over that last year, we saw rapid developments in the use of machine learning techniques to assist and amplify malign influence efforts. Early in the year, Katie Jones on LinkedIn was the first publicly identified instance of a deepfake face used in a social media campaign. By the end of the year, by December, this technique had gone mainstream. It was mass use in a campaign to influence US politics across Facebook that really brought this to more widespread attention. So what we see is in the disinformation arms race, the capabilities that are available to malign actors are developing and proliferating at a hugely unprecedented rate. Already, as Christopher just referred to, malign influence campaigns which leverage cyber capabilities have caused significant political upheaval in the United States and elsewhere, but the next generation of campaigns could be considerably more damaging by adopting machine learning for far greater automation and scaling. Plus, there'll be more players in the field because machine learning is no longer an exquisite technology that's available only to actors with enormous resources. It's been democratized and commodified. It's no longer just nation states that can access it because it's commercially available, or in some cases at the lower levels for free. So campaigns will no longer depend on labor-intensive human interaction with their targets. If we think back to the 2010s, a successful disinformation campaign needed humans at every stage. The concept had to be developed and the material needed to be designed and drafted and generated and spread through social media platforms. And that dissemination required the utilization of profiles which needed to be created in advance of the campaign, often manually. Then those profiles needed to be serviced by humans in order to build those social networks, generate followers, and establish their credibility. But the introduction of machine learning and potentially artificial intelligence overall will vastly enhance those capabilities for automating the reaching of mass audiences with tailored and plausible content, and that is going to render malicious actors even more powerful. Now, bots and processes on most social media platforms have become relatively easy to develop, largely because they allow developers to interact with the platform through developer APIs. And since control panels for automated postings on social media are a mature and widely and cheaply available and broadly accepted technology, it can't be that far off that development of command and control panels for disinformation operations should be expected. Combining those with parallel developments in machine learning makes it likely that they are going to control intelligent bots which are capable of generating artificial content semi-automatically. And the benefits are obvious for malign actors. It's a potentially unlimited number of accounts across multiple social media platforms that can be orchestrated by one individual through one single application, spreading content generated by artificial intelligence, pursuing one single and coordinated goal. Of course, plausibility won't be perfect when it is machines that are trying to convince humans, but then plausibility isn't often a criterion of success. Now, at the present moment, we are studying a malicious profile on LinkedIn, which is so wildly implausible that nobody that examines it for more than a couple of seconds will think it's a real human. And yet, it has reeled in targets from Atlantic Council, Chatham House, RAND, quite a few from RAND. In fact, hilariously for us, RAND's chief information security officer has fallen for this blatantly fake profile, and we're just trying to figure out how exactly that connection is going to be leveraged. But also, people who want to be convinced will embrace the most transparent fake. Current political developments show that masses of people can be impervious to evidence when they want to practice self-deception in order to keep the faith. So machine learning and AI may be increasing in plausibility. They'll never be perfect, but what they are perfect for is scalability. They're ideally suited to that, to scaling up across massive numbers processes which previously were labor intensive. That also applies to some level of deepfakes, to creating entirely new artificial individuals, because the challenge is simpler if you're creating somebody new. You just have to make content convincingly realistic as opposed to convincingly like a real person. So generating a chimera that is capable of convincing viewers that they're interacting with a real individual is very easy now to scale and to replicate, with campaigns at close to zero cost, which could be aimed simply at inducing the most careless or gullible individual out of a target set to click on the link, or astroturfing through mass, fraudulently generating messages and profiles which are designed to give the impression of widespread support for an idea, to generate this impression of political consensus in order that elected leaders in democracies are swayed into new policies. But even the production of deceptive text by output by machine learning systems is potentially highly dangerous. In the early part of the last decade, Russia found that automated systems were inadequate to influence debate on domestic or international fora and social media, and human intervention in the form of professional trolls was required. But now, with the development of intelligent fake text, trolls could finally face replacement by automated systems for all but the most sophisticated of interactions with real humans. And astroturfing with text becomes vastly easier when it's not necessary to manually craft each message or even each seed from which messages are developed. And the result of this automation could be once again a massive scaling up of operations, generating an entire fake public to influence political decisions, potentially to the point where the fake public drowns out the voices of real human individuals. The pace of development is absolutely staggering. So what do we see in the paper, Kim and I, when we look into the near future? Near ubiquitous deepfakes in the form of video or audio or still image, as accessibility of deepfake production continues to increase. Developments in human-computer interface science, especially in the field of emotional modeling, which might potentially allow deepfakes to generate real-time, lifelike responses to live interactions. It's that intelligent engagement that Christopher was referring to, but with humans as opposed to with data. Or, even more easily than that, the alteration of video to include simulated, inappropriate emotional reactions, to discredit public figures, especially as the changes made might be extremely simple and subtle and hard to detect, far harder than a straightforward overall deepfake. A simple example could be a politician discussing a military operation that claimed civilian victims, but with his altered to show indifference or even approval. And AI-generated text, allowing bots to adapt their approaches dependent on human reactions and auto-generate narratives, facilitating instant disinformation to develop responses to developing situations. Because an intelligent information warfare campaign should be able to identify the rising interest in a relevant topic or event and generate a coordinated automatic response to leverage that interest. And those response patterns could include producing counter-arguments or fake news or trolling or simple cheap propaganda. But again, it's on a mass scale and it is tailored to individual recipients. But then it would also respond in interactions, taking cues from how human targets react to the information and adjusting strategies in real time to maximize their effect. It could also change what disinformation is actually used for. Current online counterfactual disinformation efforts, particularly by Russia, tend to focus on trying to convince people that something has not happened. A particular event has not taken place. Russian troops are not where they in fact are. They have not done what they in fact have. AI could facilitate the opposite, convincing masses of people and Western politicians that something has happened when it in fact did not. It could make this vastly easier than has been the case to date. And in addition, the capability to convincingly reproduce the voice of known individuals could revolutionize principles of social engineering. We've already seen fraud undertaken by replicating the voice of chief executive officers of companies. How much further will it be before we hear the same thing applied to replicating the voices of commanding officers of military units? There are implications for individuals and companies as well as for countries as a whole, because private citizens face several different layers of risk when they are facing this kind of technology. High visibility individuals might be exploited and targeted in order to deceive others or to attack their reputation, but less prominent people are also at risk, although of a different form. That's because, as well as high-profile national security implications, there's also potential here for simple fraud in use against individuals and corporations, especially, for example, where financial services providers and manufacturers of connected devices rely increasingly on voice and face recognition to authenticate their customers. In an environment where both voices and faces can be not just imitated but replicated, that risks becoming no more secure than the text-based authentication passwords they were supposed to replace. We will continue to hear dramatic predictions of the consequences of abuse of AI for political purposes. Some of those are justified and some of them are a little overwrought. But there's another parallel process we need to bear in mind, and that is normalization of this technology, driven by the increasing and widely accepted prevalence of virtual individuals, especially for marketing purposes. And I'm going to leave you with an open question. There's a side effect of this with unpredictable social consequences, and that is the continuing erosion of confidence in whether any online interaction that you have as a real person is in fact with another real person, as opposed to a bot, an intelligent agent, a virtual individual. And the question I would like to throw open to everybody is, does this predict major social change as a problem, or will it simply become an acceptable part of our online existence in the same way as so many other seemingly dramatic changes have been normalized in the past? Thank you very much, James. Back to you.
Thanks, Keir. That's a fantastic investigation of just some of the problems that we face in terms of influence and artificial intelligence in especially modern democratic societies. And what Keir does really well, in my view, is show that these sort of state-sponsored influence operations are part of a much broader social question. Artificial intelligence, deep fakes in terms of voice and images has implications across society, from gendered relations, from democratic structures, and also economic consequences as well. And one of the questions is whether the types of platform governance and social governance solutions that can be applied across these different areas will also work for influence operations conducted by hostile states. I'm going to move on to the first of our questions now, and it goes directly to Jay. So first up in the papers and also first up in the questions. The question is, how are the attribution requirements for disruptive counter-cyber operations different to other forms of cost imposition?
Thank you, James, and thanks to the other panelists for the great comments. It really depends on what kind of disruptive counter-cyber operations we're talking about. In many cases, right, like look at Conficker, right? Here was one of the longest continual active counter-cyber operations that we had, lasting for what, a year and a half. And they never had an idea of whom they were countering. It was only much later that we had arrests. They were there actively engaged in trying to stop the malware and the adversaries behind the malware, with zero sense of attribution of who was responsible. In many of the cases that we're looking at, you're countering, or the defenders were countering the malware, the command and control software itself, rather than trying to go after a known adversary. In other cases, for example, in indictments that we include quite a few of them in the paper, well, there obviously you have to have it down to persona involved, and even better than just persona, the organizational affiliation of those people. So that way you can not just name and shame a person, but you can tie it more directly to the government involved. So, and that's what we hope are the kinds of things that can come out of this paper, is looking at where you have to have attribution for it and where it is just a nice plus.
Fantastic. And this question of attribution and how far that's necessary should always be put in the context of saying there are many kinds of attribution, right? There's attribution performed for legal, for political purposes, and also technical attribution. So we can get very deep into that topic very quickly. I want to move on to Chris and ask you a question about the possibility for upgrading deceptive defensive actions in terms of the use of artificial intelligence. If we think that artificial intelligence systems can be subverted, can be poisoned, is there a possibility for deceptive operations within defenders' networks to try and poison attackers' artificial intelligence systems, or is that something you don't see as a realistic possibility?
Thanks for the question. It's a really good one. I do see it as a possibility. As I say in the paper, I think adopting some kind of basic assumption of a tit-for-tat gradual escalation of sophistication on both the offense and the defense is somewhat reasonable when it comes to the AI upgrading of cyber. But there are problems, and the reason I chose to focus on the strategic level here is you have these problems of adversarial learning. The metaphor of the generative adversarial network, which is at the heart of the deepfakes that are discussed in Keir's paper, are a really good kind of metaphor for what I'm talking about here. As one side gets better, the other side inevitably tries to compromise the upgrading that is just they try to balance essentially against the offender or the defender effort. But the real issue I see here is the kind of poisoning of the game itself. If you have this situation where a game is being played between two sides, but much of the play begins to focus on poisoning the basic rule set, then you have an odd situation where actors are no longer necessarily, safe in committing to the parameters of strategic engagement that they initially have laid out before them. I think an interesting thing with AI, and particularly with these kind of cyber AI attacks, not just cyber operations upgraded by with machine learning, but actual attacks, input attacks, but particularly poisoning attacks themselves, you potentially have this scenario where much low intensity engagement becomes prospectively much more threatening to the core functional capabilities of the national security enterprise, way beyond what is currently the case. And so you get this situation there where I think strategists may be forced to either by demonstration or by explicit declaration attempt to begin to offer tighter definitions of what activities are acceptable on the part of the adversary. And I certainly think a part of that in the next decade is that we'll see is strategists trying to figure out how they can demonstrate what is acceptable in a way that parses apart espionage, which under the current version of the strategy is kind of held apart as okay from poisoning operations and that kind of thing. And all this, I personally think all this seems pretty likely, right? Because the logic of persistent engagement emerges in trusting an invisible hand of market correction, which works to produce behavioral equilibrium. The strategy would surely fail, though, if, again, trust in the integrity of the hand flags. Actors, again, have to understand the limits of the game they're playing, and the threat of a subverted rule set is going to motivate assertive action to stabilize the battle space. And so it's not necessarily a question of can the defenders counter the attackers with their own sophistication of defensive efforts. Absolutely they can. It's a strategic question about the nature of the game being played.
And that's a fantastic point, and one that links very closely to Keir's paper in terms of overall trust in the environment we're in, whether it's a conflictual international space of operations conducted by different actors, or more broadly, the information environment that we interact with as societies in the modern age. So for Keir, the next question is really on this distinction between inside and outside in terms of information operations and artificial intelligence enabled influence. We see a lot of information influence operations at the moment pick up on and exploit existing social divisions. How will the and also we see actors inside societies inside countries use the same techniques as those outside them as well for influence. How does this sort of domestic and foreign interference relationship work for artificial intelligence enabled influence? Okay, we can't hear you.
Classic mistake, thank you. One of the underlying principles is common to all of the different issues that's just opened up is that some things don't change. The pace of technological development in the arms race in technical terms might be breathtaking, but a lot of this relies on unchanging principles. Whether it's deterrence, as Christopher was just alluding to, it's not just the technical side of it, but also the interaction between the two sides. Or in the case of disinformation and malign influence, it's human nature, it's human susceptibilities that they play on, and as you just mentioned, riding already existing social tensions as opposed to inventing them from scratch. It's going to be a vastly more complicated environment. In fact, it already is a vastly more complicated environment, because not only have the tools for waging this kind of warfare been democratized, but also there are more actors that are willing to engage in them. So if we think of the toxic super spreaders of disinformation, as you just alluded to, it is not just nation states that are seeking to subvert and erode and undermine social cohesion and liberal democracies in order to weaken them. It's actually elected political figures in those countries themselves that are weaponizing the same techniques against their own population with no visible signs of restraint. So why would they not adopt and embrace new tools as they become available? Put it all together and you get a vastly more messy and complex environment within which not just individuals, but those who seek to defend democratic principles have to thread their way through and find out just what exactly is really happening and what to do about it. Put it all together, and in fact, you have a situation where there are layers upon layers of complexity when divining that last point that I made. Who are you talking to? Are they telling the truth? Where is the truth? How can you find it? It's going to become enormously more challenging. And of course, a case in point that proves the point, if you like, is what's happening at the moment with online radicalization, with the pandemic, where people retreat more to online worlds and are deprived of that interaction with real individuals, deprived of that social interaction that so often provides a reality check when they're being fed false information online. The pace of radicalization and the pace at which all of these disinformation campaigns moving forward is vastly accelerated. I think that is a harbinger of what we may be facing in the not too distant future, pandemic or no pandemic, when there are so many different influences leveraging so many different technologies to make it look as though there is a convincing consensus in an online environment in favor of one particular position. So I did mention at the beginning, our research tends to lead to dystopian conclusions. I would very much like somebody to prove me wrong.
Me too. We have a couple of minutes left, and our final question is going to go back to Jay, and it's going to go back on the tactical level. You mentioned a bit about counter-cyber operations, and that you see these disruptive operations taking two forms. One is leaks into the public domain, where these are actors that are named and shamed, and the public know all their activities. Another one is actually trying to target infrastructure and really stop them doing what they're doing. Do you see these as two really different courses of action, or are they more the same, with the same strategic effects?
Certainly related. They're not brother and sister, but they're certainly cousins. And so what we were trying to do in the paper is to associate all of these together so that we can take the parts of them that are similar, right, of trying to take active measures on your own to influence the adversary's behavior or disrupt their operations. And even there, you can see part of the difference, right? Some of these are aimed at behavior. Some of them are aimed at decision-making. It's aimed at trying to change things that's happening in the adversary's head. Well, that's very different from a bot takedown. You don't care necessarily who your adversary is or what's going on in their head. You're trying to directly stop the technology. One is more policy, one is more operations. But that is absolutely okay. We can take what these things have in common so that defenders can look across have a larger toolbox to say, okay, we might not have, per the last question, really strong attribution. We have to take these tools and put them to one side for now, yet we still have this rich set of other tools which we can rely on. If you know your adversary is doing something, but you can't be quite sure exactly what, well, then that one set of tools you can't use, and you have to depend on these others that are relying on, that are looking to influence what's happening in their minds. Some of this work had been done before, like the pyramid of pain or other areas, but we're trying to unite it a little bit more, especially for scholars.
That's fantastic. And with that, I have to draw it to a close. I really like to thank our phenomenal panelists, Jay Healy, Chris White, and Keir Giles. I really encourage you to read the papers. There's so much in them that we couldn't cover now, but thanks, and a virtual round of applause to everyone involved.
Thank you. And from Tallinn, thank you to the moderator, Professor Shires, and the panelists for providing us with this highly interesting and thought-provoking session to round off our strategy policy day of the virtual book launch of the CyCon proceedings. Also, of course, thanks to the audience for listening in. We hope that the sessions in the following days will be equally interesting.
I too would like to express my thanks, and we hope to see you again tomorrow for the legal sessions at 1600 Eastern European time. So stay tuned and have a nice day or have a nice evening.